Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is November 11th, 2014, and my guest is Emily Oster of the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Emily, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thank you very much.
Our topic for today is a paper you've co-authored with Alice Chen and Heidi Williams on infant mortality. In particular, you're looking at why the United States has higher rates of infant mortality than many European countries. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about this particular issue, which I'm very interested in itself. But I'm also more interested in the general question of how we use health data to evaluate public policy and to think about ways to make things better. So I hope we'll get into those issues as well in today's episode. Let's start with what is to be explained. What kind of differences are we talking about between the United States and Europe?
So they're very large. So if you look at the sort of baseline, like what is the World Development Indicator, or there are the differences in infant mortality rates, the U.S. ranks something like 50th internationally, and the difference between the U.S. and a frontier country like Finland or Sweden is something like 3 deaths in 1,000. So the infant mortality rate in the U.S. is about 6 in 1,000. In these other places, it's about 3. And, if you think about that, that amounts to something like 12,000 excess deaths a year among live-born infants. And so that's a reasonably large number. It's certainly very large as a share.
Right, it's double, which seems like a very large number. 3 seems small. 12,000 seems horrible, right? So it is an interesting example in and of itself of the challenges of trying to assess what's big and small. But I think the 100% part, the fact that our United States rate is double that of, say, Finland, is surprising and interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of how people have thought about this. On the one hand, the good news is in all of these places, the infant mortality rate is very low relative to historical norms or relative to developing countries. On the other hand, clearly there's a long way to go, and there are many places, most of Europe, even places outside there, which are doing much, much better than the U.S. on this dimension, and there's no particular reason that we think that should have to be.
And to put it into historical perspective, the number I have used in the past for infant mortality in 1900, and infant mortality, we're going to get into the definition, but it's usually, when you just say infant mortality, it's death within the first year of life. In 1900, the data I have seen says it was 1 in 10, and now it's about 0.5 per 100 or 6 per 1,000. So It's about a 20-fold improvement since in the last century.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. I mean, those changes should not be forgotten. I mean, there's enormous amounts of progress that have been made on this dimension, and I think that's really wonderful.
So let's start with the just the fact itself, which seems like a fact, but of course all facts have context and there's issues of measurement and definition. So how is infant mortality defined in the data that is usually used that we're talking about at the national level, say 6 per 1,000, 3 in the United States, 2 or 3 per 1,000 in Scandinavia? What is the definition?
So the definition is deaths in the first year among live-born infants. So that is the definition. And when you see numbers that are reported by the World Development Indicators or the CIA has some numbers, that's the number that you're going to get, and that's reported by the country. And so one of the issues that I think often comes up that we do talk about in the paper is that how you define a live-born infant actually varies. And so in particular, human gestation is intended to be approximately 40 weeks. Infants born before 22 weeks are effectively never survive. But there are there is a lot of variation across countries in whether you ever report infants born in that earlier period before 22 weeks as live births, and that those kind of reporting issues actually do potentially bias some of these comparisons. So because if you report any deaths, any live births in that period, there are certainly going to be also that is going to count as a death. You can inflate the number. So the first thing we do in the paper, which is sort of possible because of the kinds of data we have, is limit to what we think of as a comparable sample, where kind of all of the countries are reporting infants in that range as live births, and that actually turns out to make some difference. So the difference between the U.S. And the comparison countries we use, which are Finland and Austria, shrinks from 3 to 2 deaths per thousand once you adjust for these differences in reporting. So that's certainly something to sort of start thinking about.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, but just to make it clear, when you say the difference shrinks from 3 to 2, so right now the raw difference is 6 per thousand in the U.S. versus 3 per thousand in, say, Finland. So that's a difference of 3, and a third of that difference is data-driven, is what you're saying.
Exactly. A third of that difference is reporting-driven.
Before we get to that, we should give listeners some feel for the range outside of the developed world. There are countries, tragically, with infant mortality rates over 100 per thousand still, correct? And that's the equivalent of a 1900 level of infant mortality.
Yeah, there are certainly places like that. Afghanistan would be in this category. Some countries in Africa. If you take a country like India, which is, of course, very large, if they report infant mortality rate something like 40 in 1,000, so still very, very big. And then this goes all the way down to about 2 in the places that are doing the best, which would be like Sweden, maybe Japan.
But I'm thinking when you talk about the definition and how live birth is defined, in some countries, particularly poor countries, I assume there's variation in a preterm baby, whether it's a preterm infant, whether it's defined as a live birth or not.
Yeah, I think so. And the truth is, in most of these developing countries where these rates are so high, those differences are not going to be very important in the scheme of the overall level. So part of what makes these reporting differences potentially important when you're comparing, say, the U.S. to Europe is that already the rates are pretty low.
Right.
And so things that kind of matter a little bit are going to matter sort of relatively more as a share. When you're talking about a place with an infant mortality rate of 150 per thousand, small differences in reporting are going to be vanishing in the scheme of those comparisons.
Right. But I do want to mention, in my quick look at the data, there is improvement in the last 5 years, even in those poor countries.
Yes. No, all of this has been getting much better, much better over time. And I think that's a function of better healthcare and more vaccinations and, some better sanitation and other policies. And so I think things have really been improving, which is, again, like broadly, this problem is getting much better, which is very encouraging.
And one of the challenges of thinking about this is that there's specific things like you just mentioned, sanitation, healthcare. But as my first thought, stepping back from this, is that resources generally are really important. Per capita, some measure of standard of living is going to be extremely important. And that, of course, is why it's such a puzzle that the U.S., which is a very rich nation, still is twice the rate of, say, Finland.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like almost everything, this is going to line up with income, and it broadly does line up with income, and it is puzzling that the U.S. is down in, like, next to Croatia, even though, the U.S. is much, much richer than Croatia.
About 3 times, if I remember correctly from your paper. Yeah. So let's talk about some definitions and a little bit about how data get collected in this area. So when you talk about the World Development Indicators, I assume every hospital in the United States has some requirement to report births, deaths, and those numbers get aggregated in some way and then sent to some international source, and that's where we get the 6 from. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So these are going to come in the U.S. from what are called the natality detail files, which are collected and reported by the CDC. So they're basically like short form birth certificate data. So you can actually see not people's names and addresses, but for each birth, you see, the characteristics of the birth, things that happened, the gestation, the birth weight, and so on, and then that's linked to deaths in the first year. So that's like a nationally available, nationally curated data set, and that is how those are the numbers that will be then reported to in international statistics for the U.S.
So that's the birth side, and that word in there you used was natality, correct? N-A-T-A.
Natality,
yeah, it's a tough word. Don't use it that often in everyday conversation.
It sure doesn't come up.
But that's the birth side. How do we know that a child, if an infant dies, tragically in the hospital, that gets counted pretty straightforwardly, I assume, or if it's born and doesn't survive the delivery, again, there's a question whether it was a live birth or not, depending on how many weeks it was, maybe. But an infant that dies at 6 months or 11 months, how does that get into the data?
So there are mortality reporting files in the U.S. also. And so deaths get reported in the same kind of systemized way, and then sort of in the back room somewhere at the CDC, these things get linked. So you can actually get access to the birth data linked to information on death, including the recorded cause of death and the sort of standard stuff that would be on a death certificate.
And that's going on in every country. That's
going on in many developed countries. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Why do you say many?
Well, I mean, we as part of this project, actually, we tried to get this equivalent data for as many countries as we could. And some we did. We got some. I think some of them are just not sort of linking this in quite the same way, such that you could use it like this. But some version of this, where you're recording births and then you're recording deaths, some version of that is happening in all developed countries for sure.
What's not happening that would make it hard to use? You say it's not happening in every country. What's going on?
Well, I think in many poor countries, births and deaths are not reported in a consistent way, and so these numbers for mortality are taken from smaller scale surveys or from estimates from parts of the population or from various kinds of inference. And I think it's very complicated. Even in developed countries, it's not obvious that there's no particular reason that you need to have the micro individual birth data linked to individual death data, except for research purposes. And so I think in many countries that doesn't happen.
Okay, so let's go to your data. You have a different kind of data. You call it microdata. Describe it, and what are its advantages? So
we've got this data that I described for the U.S., where we see every birth. We're looking at 2000 to 2005, so we see every birth linked to information about death in the first year if the infant died. And then we have effectively the same data from Finland and Austria. So it's every birth linked to information about the birth, the birth weight, the gestation, some things about the mother, and then also linked to information about deaths in the first year, including exactly when, at what age the infant died, and some information on cause of death. So we have quite a rich and comparable data set across all three places.
Why did you choose those three?
So the truth is that we actually tried to get this data from every place that we could.
Sure.
And these are, so we knew we had this from the U.S. This is very commonly used. For the European countries, they basically just, mass called and emailed all the European countries in an attempt to get this. And these are the two that worked out. We also have some data from the UK and from Belgium where it's a little more aggregated, so we can't do quite the same analysis, but we can do some of our analyses there. So it turns out, I think, these are good comparison countries because Finland is kind of in this frontier of places that are doing really, really well, and Austria is kind of right in the middle of the U.S. distribution. But I can't say that we did this in some way that was that well thought out.
No, you took what you got, which is
what we got.
Yeah, which is fine. And let's talk about the other data that's in there besides birth and death. So you have information about the mother. Is this a sample, or is this purporting to be exhaustive?
This is a universe.
Okay, so purporting to be exhaustive. When my wife gave birth, the hospital had a bunch of information about her. What kind of information would they have? And obviously, when the baby is born, they do a bunch of tests. The baby is weighed. The baby is the height, length. It's not really height because they're not standing up, but it's the length of the baby. There's APGAR scores, which you should describe what those are. And what other stuff do we get that's required?
Yeah, we have everything. So an APGAR score is the sort of most commonly used measure of just how is the baby doing at birth. It's on a scale from 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, I guess. And so like a 9 would be the sort of standard, like everything is looking good kind of score. And so that's a sort of summary of how well the baby's breathing and so on. So we see that. We see the weight. We see the length. We see the gestation. We see a bunch of information about complications of labor and delivery and complications with the baby. So if the infant has a birth defect, that's recorded. A heart problem or Down syndrome that goes in this data. If the labor was very fast or very slow, or there was a C-section, all of that stuff goes in the data. So it's quite a rich sort of set of information about the circumstances of the birth and characteristics of the infant.
What do you know about the mom or the dad?
So we know a little. We know the education. We know their race. We know their birth country. Obviously, we know the location of the birth and the location of residence. And assuming that there's a father around, his education is also recorded, and marital status and that type of thing. So some like what you think of as sort of basic demographic information.
How do you get the education? Where does that education number come from? Because that's important, obviously.
So this is all in these natality files, and it is, I think, intended to be reported in this like long-form birth certificate information. I mean, I remember being asked when I had my daughter. I remember being asked at the hospital, like, how much education do you have? So
I don't remember
guess they were writing that down.
That's the kind of question I don't like.
A lot of other stuff was going on, so it probably was not, had I not been thinking about this research project, it probably would not have been front of mind.
Yeah, right? I just don't remember anything remotely like providing that information. But of course, I have health insurance, but not everybody does. So I'm just wondering how. But say you say you have the universe of all births, say in the United States in 2000 to 2005. There must be missing data, lots of missing data.
I mean, there is. I think it seems very likely that there are births that are missed. Births are supposed to be, in order to get a Social Security card and be able to like work and be a U.S. citizen, you must have a birth certificate. This information is collected as part of the birth certificate. So, like, at least some of this information. So, if you're born in a hospital, you're getting this. If you're born at home, you are supposed to get this information. This information is supposed to be collected, so then you can get a birth certificate. Now, what is almost certainly true is if there is a birth at home, all of the like details about the medical procedures that occurred during the birth and so on are likely to be less well reported. But basically anything that happens in a hospital, most of the complicated information here would have nothing to do with the individual having to report it. It would be reported by the hospital, by the doctor. So I think in that sense,
So just out of curiosity, do you know what proportion of births are home versus hospital? I assume it's very small, the home births.
It's very small. It's like half of 1%.
Okay. So that's, you have that for the United States, you have it for Finland, you have it for Austria. And so you've got a lot of micro information about the birth that's not in the national numbers that we normally see. And now tell us what you found when you looked more carefully, given that data, about what might explain those differences.
Yeah, so I think we were pretty focused on trying to think about the kind of accounting problem, and we broke it down in sort of 4 parts. So first, there's this issue of reporting, and so just kind of limiting to a sample we thought was comparable. The second issue is looking at differences in prematurity. So this is an issue that gets a lot of attention in the U.S. The U.S. has a high rate of prematurity, meaning a large share of babies born prior to what we'd consider a completed gestation. And so we find that both reporting and prematurity matter a fair amount. So as I said, about a third of this gap between the U.S. and elsewhere is closed by this reporting issue, and we do find that also, particularly compared to Finland, but also to some extent compared to Austria, the differences in prematurity matter. I think the thing that's most interesting, that is most different from what people have found before, is in these data we're able to separate the neonatal period, so the very early period after birth, the first week or the first month, from what happens after that. And this distinction is kind of very central because the things that cause death in those two periods are very different. And what we find is actually conditional on birth weight, the U.S. is doing very well early on. So in the first week or the first month, we're actually doing better than Finland and very, very comparable to Austria. And then when we move to the period from a month to a year of life, when infants are typically at home and a lot of deaths occur, in the household in some way, that is the period in which the U.S. is really lagging behind other countries, and really that is driving a lot of these differences. And I think that was the most surprising thing we saw.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to come back to that, but I want to start with the two issues you just mentioned. You started with, which are the reporting issue and the prematurity issue. Let's talk about the reporting issue. How did you? I'd like to give the listeners a feel for how you actually, quote, controlled for that. What did you do to your data to take the reporting differences out of the measurement?
So it's pretty straightforward. So we did basically three things. We took out infants where the gestational age was less than 22 weeks. We took out infants where the gestational age was less than, where the weight at birth was less than 500 grams, because these are kind of standard reporting things. And so all countries report babies in the categories of, later than 22 weeks, larger than 500 grams, and there's variation below that. And we also, in this case, we took out singleton births. We took out plural births, not because of issues of reporting, but because there are many more of those in the U.S., probably due to assisted reproductive technologies.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, because those infants are more vulnerable, you would like to kind of compare apples to apples and look at singleton births. So that's all we did. It was not an especially sophisticated way to approach this. We just took out things we thought were where the reporting was not consistent.
But what's interesting is that the U.S. then has more deliveries at less than 22 weeks and more deliveries under 500 grams birth weight. Is that right?
No, that's not so clear. So that's the issue, because if this is supposed to be reporting of live births, so I think the way you want to think about it is if the infant is born at 20 weeks and kind of moves around a little bit, that will sometimes in the U.S. get reported as a live birth, but it would not get reported as a live birth in these other places. So it is possible the U.S. has more births in that period, but that is not something we can see in the data because we're simply not seeing those observations elsewhere because they're getting reported as miscarriages or stillbirths.
And 500 grams is, according to my crude effort, is that about a pound?
Yeah, it's about a pound.
So that's the average birth weight of a full-term baby is about, I assume, 7 to 8 pounds?
About 7.
Yeah, okay. So that's remarkably small. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. Did we talk about prematurity while I was doing that? Did you talk about while I was doing my conversion just there?
We didn't. I mean, I mentioned prematurity. We can talk more about that.
Yeah, tell me what you did to deal with that.
So what we do to deal with that is we just we put in basically adjustments for either gestational week or, in fact, what we use is birth weight. So it turns out birth weight in these data are much better recorded than gestational age, which is not surprising. The way you record gestational age is by asking the woman, when was your last period? When did people don't? This is a hard thing to remember. Birth weight is very precise. It's measured in the hospital, and the correlation is obviously very, very, very high. So we use birth weight, and we basically, one thing is we just look at the comparison across the countries, and we say basically if the U.S. adopted the birth weight distribution, like magically acquired the birth weight distribution of one of these other countries, but kept the mortality conditional on birth weight the same, how much of the gap would that close? So it's sort of like a counterfactual, like if that was the only thing that we changed,
right,
how much of a difference would it make? And the answer there is it would close much of the gap with Finland, something like 75%, but only about a third, but less than a third of the gap with Austria. So it clearly matters, but it matters a lot more relative to Scandinavia.
So state that again. If the U.S., I mean, how different is the birth weight distribution? That's what's so surprising, right?
So it's interesting. So if you look, we have some graphs in the paper, which of course are difficult to explain on the podcast, but you can look at them.
We will put a link up to the paper, of course.
Excellent. So check out Figure 2. One of the things you can see is actually the U.S. and Austria have really, really, really similar birth weight. The only place they differentiate is a little bit at the very bottom. The U.S. has a few more babies in the kind of 500 to 1,000 grams, but they're very similar. The big difference is that Finnish babies are much larger than either of the other places, like much, much larger. And I don't think there's not a great explanation for that. One possibility is just like the Finns are tall and they have giant babies. I think that's something that's a little hard to tell. But for example, they're more than 200 grams heavier on average than babies in the U.S. So that turns out to matter. They're also, the rates of prematurity are just lower. And that's actually something we know to be true. Like that's a commonly observed fact that is not very well understood because we don't know really what causes infants to be born prematurely, which is making it very difficult to understand why it might differ across space.
Right. So, and you said we don't know very much. Do we know anything?
Basically, we know a few things. So for example, smoking increases the rate of prematurity. Using drugs like meth, also not good. But beyond those things, that's it. So we don't 12% of births or 10% of births in the U.S. are preterm, and obviously 10% of women are not smoking and using methamphetamines, and so there's a tremendous amount of variation that we just have a very, very poor understanding of.
There's a random component that may be related to other things, but we don't know what they are, is what you're saying.
Exactly. There's some random component. It's probably related to some other stuff. We don't know what it is. Right. This is related to the fact that we don't actually know what causes women to go into labor in the first place, or we have only a very poor understanding of that, even at term, like at full term. We just don't know very much about what are the biological mechanisms that prompt that to happen.
There's not a switch, strangely enough.
There's not a switch, exactly.
Or if there is, we don't know where it is.
Yeah, probably there is a switch, but we haven't figured out how to turn it off and on.
Yeah, but we do know, I guess the only thing I know about this, and I assume there's some evidence for it, is that, and of course, Emily was her previous EconTalk appearance was talking about what we know about pregnancy, which is sometimes less than we'd like to know. The thing that I think we know is that not being active slows it down. At least women who are at risk of delivering early are told to take it easy. Is that? Do we know that actually works? Right? Not just take it easy. They get put on bed rest.
That doesn't work.
Bed rest does not work?
No, bed rest does not work.
How do we know that?
Randomized trials.
Because women get put on bed rest. I say people, women.
Sure.
Women get put on bed rest all the time, right?
No, this is one of the most, when we did this sort of earlier stuff about pregnancy, this is a very striking fact. A lot of people are put on bed rest. I think it is increasingly well accepted. Bed rest is definitely not useful for preventing premature babies or doing anything. It's actually pretty bad. It has some other negative consequences. So systems just lay around, not effective.
Wow. It does have an 18th century ring to it.
Sure,
which
yeah.
makes,
everyone likes to relax,
nervous.
right? I think it turns out it sounds great when you're pregnant, it sounds great to be like, oh, I'll just like lay in the bed. But actually being forced to lay in your bed all the time is very unpleasant.
Okay, good to know. So let's regroup here. Let's summarize what you've told us so far. We've got controlling for birth weight, prematurity. Is that the only two we've talked about so far?
Yeah, so adjusting for reporting differences and kind of adjusting for prematurity, you find, the U.S. is still substantially worse off than elsewhere. So even if we had the same levels of birth weight as these other places, things would still be much worse in the U.S.
But not relative to Finland.
But much less so relative to Finland. That's true.
Yes. But relative to Austria.
Slightly worse.
Okay.
But relative to Austria, much worse, slightly worse relative to Finland.
So let's turn to the surprising finding, which is fascinating, which is that neonatal, which I guess means close to birth, as you said, first week or so, maybe first month, U.S. Infant mortality neonatal mortality is very, very good relative to these two countries at least, whereas the, say, month 2 through 12, it's where the U.S. is doing much worse. And this, of course, is not visible in the standard national data because that just looks at any time within the first year. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's actually, it's sort of even in some sense harder than that because sometimes in these national data sets, they do separate like the first month and the later period. But what they are not able to do is do that controlling for birth weight. So like from a policy, so as economists, like I think, we're interested in like what we would do about policy. And so I think then the question you want to ask is conditional on the inputs that you're given, sort of conditional on the weight of the babies that are born in your hospital. How are we doing at the kind of in the neonatal period, and then how are we doing later? Because that's how you sort of think about identifying policies. And just reporting aggregate numbers, certainly overall in the first year, but even if you separated these time periods, but you didn't think about the differences in inputs, you would still be misleading. So what we find is once we are able to adjust for differences in birth weight, which we're able to do because the data is so rich, as you say, the U.S. actually looks quite good in the early period and then really, really not very good later.
So to say that a different way, let me make sure I understand it. You're saying that if you don't control for birth weight, the U.S. might have still a very high neonatal mortality rate, but that doesn't take account of the fact that the U.S. has lots of small babies, right? Which increases the risk of death. When you hold that constant, we're actually doing very well. But isn't there a question of why we have such low birth weights?
Yes, there is. But I think that is again related to this prematurity question because that's being driven by a lot of high rates of prematurity. And I think this doesn't say we shouldn't worry about that. We should worry about that. But I think from the standpoint of the sort of neonatal period, the question you'd like to ask is like, is the U.S. having a problem because our neonatal care is really terrible? And if you looked at the aggregate statistics and you saw, oh, look, the U.S. has high neonatal mortality, we might be tempted to think, well, let's like invest a lot more money in NICU care and like, making sure that we're, have high quality hospitals and that the hospitals are teched up in various ways. And
but they already are, of course.
But they already are. Actually, they're doing very well. Their inputs are not very good. But once they get the inputs, things are looking very good. And I think that kind of tells you, yes, let's think about prematurity, but, maybe think about that more so than we think about investing in NICU care.
When you say inputs, you mean the quality of the pregnancy,
the birth weight of the baby.
Yeah.
Yes.
So given that, I'm going to take the one thing we know, that I think we know. One example that if we wanted to improve the neonatal rate, then you're saying mortality rate would be the raw numbers would be to just, if we could reduce the smoking rate, if people stop smoking or chose to stop smoking, that would presumably increase the number of births that come to term and would improve the survival rate.
Yes. No, that's definitely true. Although, in fact, those effects are probably pretty small. Like even the smoking as like the one thing we know to matter, it actually the rates are not, the impacts are not that big. But certainly that is, yes. And if we got people to stop, I actually think this methamphetamine thing is not a trivial problem. And so if we address that problem, that would improve neonatal mortality as well.
Yeah, but presumably that's a hard. What's your evidence or intuition for why you think that's a serious problem? Because obviously you don't have any good data on that.
I would say the internet, which is probably not the best source of this. Some of this is from talking to people who, like doctors who treat women in areas that have high prematurity rates, and this comes up in certain parts of the U.S. This comes up in discussions as an issue.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But it may just be that it's very salient.
It's what? It could be.
It may just be that it feels very salient.
Sure. So let's move on to the first year problem. So the U.S., despite the raw numbers, does quite well in the neonatal mortality rate. Now, what do we call the? Is it postnatal? What do we call the?
Post-neonatal.
So the post-neonatal period, which is is it 2 months? Is it second month?
It's a month. It's a month to a year. So
okay, so in that
30 days to a year.
So there, the U.S. And if you look at the data, which, as you say, it's hard to show on the podcast, but it's shocking actually, because you see these two lines, the U.S. versus another country, they're moving along together, and then all of a sudden, the U.S. diverges dramatically in the first year as time passes in the life of the child. What do we think is going on there?
So it's hard to. It's very hard to say. So one of the places we tried to look for information is looking in the causes of death to try to see, is there sort of something that jumps out as like this is a particular thing that's going on. One thing we can say is it doesn't seem to be differences in like congenital abnormalities, which is actually a pretty common cause of death, but doesn't seem to be more common in the U.S. But it turns out most of the excess deaths are things like SIDS, accidents, to some small extent, assaults. So that's somewhat informative, but since SIDS is the most common cause of death in this period, it is not actually that informative to say that it is also accounting for the largest share of the difference.
SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome, which is...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say so it's sudden infant death syndrome, and it's a kind of intended to be a cause of death that refers to something specific, which is like the infant just stopped breathing and died, although in practice it ends up capturing a lot of residual sort of things that happened when we don't really know what actually happened. Yeah,
in a way by the way it's, of course, phrased, it's a way of saying we don't know what happened.
Yes.
Do we know any? Our children were all born in the 90s, and that was right at the time when there was a great deal of anxiety about SIDS. What's the state of our knowledge about it, and what do we know about what prevents it, if anything? At the time, there was a worry about babies sleeping on their stomach, and everyone was told to have the baby sleep on their side. And I think, well, you tell me, what do we know about it?
Yeah, so I think that turns out to be actually a pretty good policy. So your baby should sleep on its back. I think we've in general moved towards a kind of view that the infant should be sleeping on its back with no blankets, in a crib with no pillows or anything. And I think that's the etiology of SIDS is such that basically an infant just stops breathing, and so things which make the infant sleep less soundly tend to have some positive impacts on this. So having a fan in the room, for example,
you say less soundly?
Yeah. Basically, if the infant is sleeping too soundly, they forget to breathe. That's kind of like that's not the only thing that happens, but I think that's sort of part of the understanding is that like they just stop breathing. And so when you are not as soundly asleep, that is happening to somewhat less of an extent. And so things like having a pacifier and having a fan in the room are both things that are now, I think, recommended as ways to lower the SIDS risk. But this back to sleep thing is the biggest issue, and has had quite large impacts on the rates of SIDS over time. You can see pretty clearly that campaign in the time series.
But it's a very small number, right?
It's a small number.
Let's talk about the magnitudes in general when we're talking about this difference in the U.S. to, say, Finland or U.S. to Austria postnatal death mortality rate. What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
About 1 in 1,000.
Right.
So the sort of difference in this period is about 1 in 1,000 deaths. And so that says if you could kind of move the U.S. to the rate of, say, Austria in this period, holding constant the situation at birth and holding constant, what's happening in the first month, you would decrease the overall mortality by about 1 in 1,000 deaths, and that's about 4,000 deaths a year. So, it's not an enormous number, but it's a reasonably large.
Well, every one of them is horrific. So,
exactly. So, it's like a very terrible thing to happen. So
unbearable. The question is, and I'm sure you've thought about it. The question is, how much of 1 in 1,000 is a small number. Is it how much of that is a random difference that might not show up year in, year out, and is due to unpredictable, unknowable things? What are your thoughts on that?
These differences are pretty consistent in our data over this period. And obviously, there's a statistical statement, which is that they're very precise, and there are an enormous number. These regressions have 25 million observations or something. So I think at that level, I think it's unlikely that this is driven sort of totally by chance. And that's sort of as far as we got thinking about that, I guess.
But and we're going to come. Well, let's come to this now. The other issue, obviously, is what we would call socioeconomic poverty, violence. Try to summarize. You touched on it before. Try to summarize what we know about that 1 in 1,000, where it's coming from. Obviously, some of it is. It's hard to believe that there's an important difference in how U.S. parents are using pillows versus Finnish parents in terms of SIDS rates. So what might matter that's important? Try to break it down again for causes.
So, what we do on the socioeconomic status stuff is we basically try to ask the question in the sort of high SES groups, so which we think about as like college educated in the U.S. white.
SES is socioeconomic status.
Sorry. Yeah. So if you take like college educated white married women in the U.S. and compare them to the similar demographic in Finland and Austria, so high education married women, to basically see, is this a difference across countries which is kind of existing everywhere in the socioeconomic status distribution? And we find that it's not. So these sort of white college educated married women in the U.S. look, in terms of their mortality, their infants' mortality rates, they look just like that comparable group elsewhere. So it is not the case that group is doing worse than these other countries. What's happening is that there's relatively small differences in either Finland or Austria across these parts of the kind of socioeconomic status distribution, whereas in the U.S. there are very, very large differences across groups, and that turns out to be kind of basically driving most of these differences. And
there's just a lot of different factors to socioeconomic status. So what did you find are some factors more important than others?
This is being driven by education, basically. Now, that doesn't mean that's not exactly the answer you're looking for, because that doesn't tell you what it is about the education. But the most important variable in this is education.
We don't know what that means exactly, because obviously education tends to be is correlated with income.
Yeah,
it'd be great if we said, more educated women know more stuff about how to be good mothers, and therefore we just need to get that information to people who have less education. But it's not that simple.
No, and actually, we looked at some point we tried, this isn't in the current draft of the paper, we tried to look at, particular behaviors, things like back to sleep or like smoking. And we found that in a lot of those cases, it's true that, high socioeconomic status women in the U.S. undertake sort of better behaviors on those dimensions than lower socioeconomic status women. But that's also true elsewhere. So those differences in the U.S. across groups in behaviors didn't seem to be particularly large relative to the differences elsewhere. So there wasn't like some behavior that sort of stuck out as a smoking gun.
But if I understand what you said correctly, you're saying that Finland's, and to some extent Austria, is less diverse than the United States racially. It's less diverse economically, I assume. And if the United States had going back to your earlier statements, if the United States had the same birth weight and the same socioeconomic status as Finland and Austria, there would be virtually no difference between the infant mortality rates.
Yeah, that's true. Now, of course, that's like, as a policy, get everyone as rich as Finland is pretty daunting. And I think, part of the challenge we're trying to think through whether we can push this forward all is thinking about, are there things you could do that are sort of smaller scale than just like bring everybody to the income level of Finland that would kind of ameliorate some of these problems in a kind of more micro, focusing more on this particular issue as opposed to like trying to fix the whole sort of setup.
And
I mean, the one thing that we talk a little bit about in the paper is some kind of home visiting program, which I think is something that's gotten, some significant policy discussion in the U.S. of late. So in all of these European countries, these two and basically all the rest of them, they have programs where someone comes like to your house after you are home with your kid and gives you some advice and tells you something about, how to parent. And I think that those programs actually continue for some period of time after the birth. We don't have much of that in the U.S. You can see why a program like that might be of particular use to people with limited resources who maybe don't have as many places to go for advice and information. And, I don't know if you remember how much you were like, but when I brought home my daughter, it was sort of like, there you are in your house with your kid. And like, I guess it's going to wake up. Like I have to do something with it. It's very hard to figure out what exactly to be doing with a baby. And I think, that problem becomes more acute as resource constraints bind. And so I think one thing that people have seen in the U.S. in some of these home visiting programs is that they do have some effects on mortality. So I think that's one kind of policy one might imagine ramping up.
Yeah, I remember wanting desperately to have a manual.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially that first night. Our daughter was crying like a baby, and we're thinking, what do we do now?
Yeah.
Yet, we know that thousands of parents have successfully negotiated this challenge because we're here. Most of it works on its own, comes naturally. We're now trying to, what we're talking about now is that last half of a percent where, again, even given your breakdown before of, SIDS versus violence, it's great that someone might come to my house and say, by the way, although I wouldn't want them to, I just want to say on the record, and I'm not sure I'd want to pay for it, but and I'm not sure it's a good idea. But if someone came to my house, whether it's my own parent, or a neighbor, and said, by the way, it's good to have the baby sleep on its back, that seems like a good thing. Of course, implementing it's not straightforward at all.
Yes.
And it would seem to me that the rest of the categorization of that last bit of possible improvement we can make it seems like it might be just purely cultural. Do you think that's a reasonable conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing to caution is when we sort of start talking about small numbers, there are pockets in the U.S. where these numbers are much bigger. So, for example, among Black women with less than a high school education in Cook County, which would basically be the south side of Chicago, the infant mortality rate in this period is about 16 per 1,000, which is obviously a lot bigger. And so that suggests that there may be scope in particular pockets to actually have much larger changes. And I think it's more potentially than things like your kid should sleep on your back. I think that it's many of these programs are sort of a somewhat more holistic view about kind of how do you think about parenting, and when is it okay to give your kid solid food, and does your kid look like they're doing okay? And I think those are the kinds of things they're trying to communicate. But I agree, the implementation issues here are very, very difficult.
So that rate of 16 on the south side, how does that break down between first month and post?
So I don't know actually.
Okay, so that's interesting. Have you thought about other issues? I mean, one issue I've heard people worry about is a rise in maternal mortality in the United States. Mothers dying in childbirth. Have you looked at any of that data? Those data?
I haven't. I mean, those numbers are very small. I think it's right that they've gone up a bit over time, but they're really, really, really small, which is great, but makes it harder to sort of pinpoint a particular cause.
So let's summarize. Step back and give me your assessment of what you've learned from this more nuanced and more complete data that you have on births and deaths. So we started off by saying on the surface, the U.S., despite its relative wealth, is something like Croatia. It's 51st in the world in infant mortality, which is somewhat appalling. And the question is, and we're double the countries in the world that are doing the best at keeping infants alive, such as Finland. Given that what you've looked at now, how would you summarize what we know about that picture?
I think that what I would say is that the what we get out of our data is a recognition that the issues that the U.S. is having are not issues about the kind of medical technology part of this. And I think that's in some ways surprising to people, because I think often we think about infant mortality as kind of being special and about things that are happening in hospitals and NICUs and how we're doing with very small babies. And it's true that is an important part of infant mortality, but it's not a place that the U.S. is falling down. Instead, the place that the U.S. seems to be doing worse is in the more issues of, what is happening before birth, most of which is going to be about things that are happening in people's households, and then what's happening kind of after people are home with their infants. And both of these are not unrelated to broader issues in the U.S., like we in general have a higher mortality rate among children, among adults than most other places, and sort of thinking about this a little holistically and particularly thinking about how we can support, women with infants when they are at home, I think is something that might be of some significant policy value.
Although it wouldn't be a bad idea to have everyone be as well off as they're in Finland, if we knew how to get there.
I agree.
If we knew how to get there.
If we knew how to get to a place with less inequality, I think that would also be good. But I feel like that may be a slightly more complicated thing to address.
I would say less poverty. I would not say less inequality. I would say right.
Less poverty. I think it's exactly right. Yes, it is exactly the poverty that is the issue, not the inequality per se. That's exactly right.
So close and talk about either what you feel you've learned or where you'd like to go down the road in thinking about these kinds of issues, not just infant mortality, but there's a lot of, I think, noise, not much light, a lot of yelling and posturing about the U.S. health system. There are people who want us to go more toward single payer. There are those of us like myself who would like a less centralized system, which seems very far off. But One can always dream. And one way that people argue for these different policy positions is they trot out data about life expectancy, they trot out data about infant mortality, et cetera. And I mean, to me, it's your story is a half full story in the sense that access to quality medical technology at birth does not seem to be a problem in the United States. That's glorious. Maybe we pay way too much for it. I wouldn't be surprised.
Right.
And I'm sure we do lots of things that are not.
We pay a lot for it, that's for sure.
But talk generally about this issue of healthcare data. I mean, it's a very, and we had Martha Nussbaum on recently talking about using different measures of well-being other than, say, gross domestic product, other than, say, per capita income, and people push for health measures. And obviously, it's more complicated than it might seem at first. So what's your thought? What are your thoughts on those issues?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a very, as you say, this is a very complicated area. And I think one of the issues that we clearly have in the U.S., and this, this is true in this infant mortality stuff, but it also comes up when we start talking about sort of things like obesity and diabetes and a set of, health issues which arise later in life. In all of these things, we see these huge differences across socioeconomic groups in the U.S. And I think a lot gets made of kind of, let's look at these other places and, see how much better they're doing on these various things without recognizing that the circumstances that we're facing in the U.S., given how much diversity there is and how large the differences are in income and in some sense how poor the poorest people in the U.S. are, this makes all of these problems much more difficult to tackle. And so, saying things like, so for example, I read somebody sent me something about how, Denmark has figured out how to address childhood obesity using a comprehensive family-centered plan, and that's so successful. And like, shouldn't we do this in the U.S.? And you sort of look like, okay, what's the plan? The plan is like the kids, the family eats a meal together every night. You make sure the kid doesn't have more than one helping of the, like boneless, skinless chicken breast that the mother has carefully prepared. It's like, and then the kid goes running outside. And it's like, okay, why don't you try to port that model, to the south side of Chicago? Like, where's the kid going running in 73rd Street and Stony Island, after dinner? This just is like, this isn't a realistic thing. And I think we need to try to think about some of these problems in the context of the setup that we have, the sort of broader setup. And I think it makes many of these problems much more intractable and much harder to think about it, and also means that focusing on them in kind of a minor way outside the context is just a very, very complicated and probably useless approach.
It just strikes me that so many of the things that get suggested, that's a great example, that wouldn't fly culturally in the United States, they're not going to be implemented well in the United States, wouldn't be politically popular in the United States.
Right. No, I mean, it's just not going to happen. So,
So it seems to me that, the single biggest policy thing we would like to improve in the United States is giving people ways to use their skills in the labor market, which we are not doing a great job on. And if I had to pick one thing to make health better, that would be it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think fundamentally that's, there's a lot of other things we could do around the edges, but that is a very central thing. And without that, it's going to be hard to make really, really large changes in any of these dimensions.
My guest today has been Emily Oster. Emily, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.